Hello and thank you for coming to check this out. So in this guide we're going to look at how to animate this pop-up city scene. To get started, download the Photoshop file from the link in the description and open a new motion project. This project I'm using is 1920 by 1080 at 30 frames a second. Give yourself 10 seconds or more so that you've got time to play around with ideas later. So once your project's ready and you have the file, let's bring that Photoshop file in. I'm just going to make a new group for it first. And I'll choose the import option and grab the file here, or you can just drag it straight in from Finder. But whatever you do, make sure you choose this option here or layers. Okay, so once everything's in, we have to make a couple of quick changes. If I grab this group here, you'll see that it'll disappear out the sides. So to fix that, just close down all the groups if they're open. And then shift select them all, background, hills, skyline, houses, sun and clouds. Drag them out of the group they came in with and drag them into this new group that we made, and then you can get rid of the old group. So now we can move around freely. Okay, I'm just going to check the anchor points here of our main group. Okay, and I'm going to come to properties and scale this main group up and bring everything down, scale it back a bit. Right, so now it's just a bit easier to work with. And just checking in here, all our assets are at the right scale by default of 100%. Okay, we are all ready to animate, so let's start looking at the different ways that we can do that. Okay, so the first thing to talk about is timing. What I'm running here is a video. I exported a project that I finished as a video and I brought it back into Motion. So now you see in the inspector, in properties with video clip, we get access to the playback control. So in here I can make it run slower or faster. So my advice is, as you go through this project, and if you start thinking about how is it going to look slower or faster, don't waste your time going and redoing different versions of a slow one and a fast one and that. Just finish a complete project first, then you can bring it back in and then you can see really quickly how it might look. Okay, so after that, let's talk about specific timing within the actual animation. I have a finished one here, and if we open it up, what you can see here is the spacing of each element. Everything is animating within 5 frames of the one before it, so it's 5 frames and 5 frames and 5 frames, and the next one 5 frames later, 5 frames later. Just if you're interested to know, that's the timing that I used within a group. So everything within the skyline group, everything within the house group, and so on. But the timing between the groups, so between when the skyline finishes and the hills start, or the houses start, and the background and all of that, that is going to kind of determine the personality of each one that you do. Okay, so the last point to cover, I think, is color. So we brought this in as a Photoshop file. I think the colors are pretty much locked in. if we come and grab this house here, you do have the colorize filter that you could use to play around and make things look different. I'm not sure just how useful it is, because they're coming in a specific color, and that's going to influence the color that you can make them. So you do have some control over the color, but I'd say you've got the Photoshop file there, so you can put that into, I think, Pixelmator or Affinity Designer or Illustrator or Photoshop, and change the colors and bring them back in as you like. Alright, so we've covered timing and color, so now let's get busy and look at animating this project. So to animate everything, we've got three broad choices. We could use the overshoot behavior by itself, or we could use keyframing to scale our objects and then use the overshoot behavior on the end of that to give the bouncy effect. Or we can combine the overshoot behavior with another parameter behavior to do the same thing. So what we're going to do is, just with the houses and the tall buildings, let's look at good examples of each case. And when we are done with that, I think you will know everything you need to be able to finish this project any way that you like. The first element to animate in the scene is the big tall orange building, so I'll move my playhead to 1 second and grab that element. I'll just duplicate it so we can compare some different things. So let's use the overshoot behavior first. I'll come into the properties. I'm coming to the main scale value here, and from the menu, add parameter behavior, overshoot. So I'm going to trim the behavior to 1 second, and I'll trim the shape to 1 second too, so that we don't see it before it begins to scale. I'm going to bring the anchor point right down to the bottom here. Let's drag it out so we can see. The position of the anchor point is very important, because if it was in the middle, then it's going to scale out from here rather than scale up from here. So let's give this overshoot behavior some settings. First of all, we want the total animation to be 1 second and 5 frames, in keeping with the original project, the reference project. So I'll trim the behavior out to there. The next building is going to come in 5 frames later. But our overall animation is going to be 1 second and 5 frames. So let's give this overshoot parameter behavior some settings. The start value we want as -100. The end value 0. Ramp will come to cycles 3. Okay, so down here in the keyframe editor, you can see that the ramp value is 35%, and that means it's going to take 35% of the frames to reach full scale, and then it will spend 65% of the frames bouncing around that full scale point. So that's too long for scaling. We want the ramp to finish here at 5 frames after 1 second. So I'll grab that ramp duration and pull it back. There we are. So now our building has reached 100% scale after 5 frames. Let's see how this looks. What do you think? Looks okay. You know what? Let's see what happens if we just scale the y-axis instead. So what I'm going to do is grab this overshoot behavior. I'm going to Option drag to the copy. I'll come into this setting here, apply to. I'm going to change it from transform scale all to just the Y scale. And we want to trim this orange shape to 1 second. And I'll trim the overshoot copy to finish where the other one does. So I haven't moved that anchor point. See what happens. Right. So what do you think? They're quite interesting with just the Y scale as well, I think. The acceleration slider will give us a subtle tweak to the ramping animation, so to everything that happens in this part of the overshoot curve. But over 5 frames, the difference is going to be very subtle. Okay, so that is one example of using the overshoot behavior to do everything for us. Let's, right, I'm going to grab this copy now. I'm going to delete the overshoot parameter behavior from it. Let's see what we can do with keyframing instead. So with the playhead at 1 second, I'll come into the scale setting here. I'm going to set a keyframe and drop the scale to 0. Then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds, 5 frames later, I'll bring the scale up to 100%. Now I'll drag over a copy of that overshoot. But I'm going to trim the overshoot to start to kick in at 1 second and 5 frames. And this start value here, I'm going to reset that to 0. I'm going to change that to say 10, so 10% more than its base value, so 110%. So it will stretch on that, and it's scaling everything. So let's see how that looks. So let's turn on the first one we did with just overshoot. There you go, we get some immediate differences, and obviously we have a lot of choice between using the overshoot behavior or using keyframing plus overshoot combined. What else can we do if we keyframe? Let's come into this overshoot behavior copy, and right, we can constrain the bounce even more by raising the ramp value. We could make it more exaggerated and bouncy by bringing the ramp value down. So between using the overshoot behavior and using keyframing, you've got lots of choices. Let's have a look now at using parameter behavior to scale up instead of keyframing. So I'm going to turn off these guys. Let's grab this tall yellow building. I'll drag it out. So I'm going to bring the playhead to 1 second and 5 frames, and I'm going to trim this building to start here. And let's scale this over 5 frames with a parameter behavior. And it's only 5 frames, so let's use the ramp parameter behavior. So I'll come into the scale and choose add parameter behavior, ramp, and the ramp behavior has come and trimmed to 1 second 5 frames, so I'll bring it forward to 1 second 10 frames and trim it out. I'm going to set the start value at -100. I need to move that anchor point down. Okay, so now instead of keyframing, we are using a ramp behavior instead to do that job for us. I can get subtle tweak to the animation by adjusting curvature. And now, just as we did before, let's grab Overshoot. I'll option drag it to this guy, and I'm going to shift left bracket on my keyboard to bring that forward. So we can combine parameter behavior with Overshoot as well to get other options. Let's have a look at animating these houses. Going to turn everything else off. And just grab these houses, and I'll just scale the group up so it's easier to see. I'm going to use Overshoot on these houses to animate them, but I'm going to use a different method. Just to get ready, I have gone into the group ahead, and I have moved all of our anchor points into the right place. So we will animate this house first, and then the next ones will follow 5 frames after the one before it. This blue house would usually animate at 2 seconds, just by our reference project, so I'll bring the playhead there. And this time we're going to use the overshoot behavior, but we're going to use it in a different way, and you'll see why. So I'll come into properties, and I'll grab the scale main value here and drop the menu down and choose add overshoot. But this time I'm going to let it run the length of the project. I'm not going to trim anything to the playhead. I want to enter the same value here, start value minus 100%. But you can see that it hasn't pulled the house down to 0 scale because it's the start value, and the start value is over here at the beginning of the project. So what I'm going to do is use the start offset here. 2 seconds is 60 frames, so this value in here is frames, so if I enter 60 frames in there, now the start condition has moved forward to 2 seconds and we can't see our house. It's being pulled down to 0 scale. But the end condition is over here, so I want to bring that end offset back now. So we are going to have the total animation be 1 second long. I'm going to bring this end offset. I'm just going to drag the slider until the end condition meets the playhead here at 3 seconds. So just by eye, when you're using parameter behaviors, it's very fine in here, it's hard to see. By eye you can see when the animation is stopping, so that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is to work out the exact value you need and put it into the field. I usually just pull the slider and work by eye. So I know when it stops bouncing that it's past the end condition. Okay, so the ramp here is too long. I want that ramp, maybe this time let's have it scale for, let's see what 30 does. How does this look? Hey, that's all right. So what we're going to do now is we're going to use this setup to quickly animate this one, this one, and this one, like this. I will grab the overshoot parameter behavior, I will hold Option and drag it to the next one. So this house now has a copy of the overshoot behavior we set up with this one. And but they're going to animate at the same time. I want it to come in 5 frames later, so I'll bring the playhead to 2 seconds and 5 frames. I'm just going to add 5 frames to this value here, 65. And minus 5 frames from this value, so 200 and, let's go for 206.5. Let's do it again. I'm going to use Option and drag a copy to the next house. I'm going to add 5 frames to this value and minus 5 from this value. 70 and 201.5, 201. Let's just make that 201. 201. So there you go. If you continue that way, in no time at all, you'll have animated the whole row. So that's another way that you can use the overshoot parameter behavior, and actually it's a parameter behavior, so that's how you can use many of the parameter behaviors to pass on an animation to another object quickly, and then quickly adjust the in point and out point of an animation. I think working this way is probably faster than keyframing, and it has its uses. But you know, when you keyframe, like we saw before, you do get more options with how the overall scale and bounce looks. Right, I don't want to take up any more of your time. We've looked at lots of options, and I'm sure you can find lots of other options as well. If you want to, please finish your project and show us the example. I'd really like to see it. I hope this has been useful, and thanks for watching.